r/nosleep. Hosted by you/BrittonRT. My Bleeding Heart. This is about a few different things, which may seem unrelated, but hear me out. It's about a secret government program from the 60s and 70s which you almost certainly have never heard of, but which has immensely affected your life. It is about the Woodstock Festival of 1969, and how it changed the world forever. And it is about me. See, I have a condition called ASD, or atrial septal defect. Literally means I have a hole in my heart. A small one, but a hole nonetheless. It has always caused me problems, ever since I was born. I fatigue easily and get irregular heartbeats at times. As such, my parents mostly kept me out of intense physical activities. So I mostly stayed indoors and read. I did well in school. As I got older, I had to avoid many of the things my peers were getting into. I didn't drink, in fact I never have to this day. Drugs were becoming more mainstream, but I never touched them. My general seclusion and introverted nature meant I didn't really interact with girls much either, even though it was the generation of love. I just walked the line I had been placed on, obediently, doing everything I could to earn the praise and respect of my conservative parents. They were pretty much the only people in my life back then, and they had come from hard backgrounds. The Depression, a world war, and a lifetime of struggles. They didn't want me to have to go through what they did. I worked hard for them. I got my degree in neurobiology at Harvard. It was a pretty new field, and Dr. Kuffler had only started teaching it there in '66 if I recall. I was one of his first students. I did very well in my studies, and went on to get a doctorate myself. I wrote my dissertation on how stimuli in a person's environment can affect the way they think and behave. I was very passionate about it. My dad was always worried about the war. Despite his hardline stance against communism, one I shared, he had been on the beaches of Normandy and knew what horrors awaited those who were being shipped to the other side of the world. I suppose it was part of why he had so enthusiastically supported my academic activities, despite that he never really understood them. Deferment wasn't the only benefit either. They came to me eventually, men from the government. They were interested in my work. They offered me a job. They told me they wanted to change the world. To change people. To make them better. They said other things too. That liberals, hippies, and communists were tearing the country and the world apart, and that Soviet infiltration was everywhere. Drugs and promiscuity were eviscerating the values which held our society together. I felt the same way at the time. In some ways, I was the perfect person for the job. As straight edge as any ever was. I accepted their offer with excitement, and was given my own team and lab. And so the project began. It would only take a year before we started doing our first trials based on my theories, while the Vietnam War raged in the background. It was a fitting backdrop, in retrospect. The first thing we tried was treating the PTSD which ravaged the lives and minds of so many of the brave men who had gone to help fight the Red Menace. We had some limited success, and I was happy to be helping my country. But the men up top wanted more. They thought we could go further, and every success on my part just seemed to reinforce that idea in them. And in me. I wanted to go further too. So I did. We expanded our program. I had extensive amounts of data to work with and the full weight and backing of the federal government at my disposal. If I needed something, it would be there, no questions asked. We were going to change everything. To make it better. Or at least that's what I thought. And that brings me to Woodstock. It was weird being there, so outside anything I had ever known. An orgy of drug-fueled love, violence, and music. In some ways, the world's first rave I guess. I was definitely out of my element there. But I needed to be present for the experiment. Because of my condition, I was afraid of getting too caught up in the maelstrom of people, an ocean of bodies. They seemed to be having fun. Despite the light rain and the mud. I didn't really understand it at the time. It was beyond me back then that many of these people wanted the same things I did. They wanted to change the world. To make it better. They just had a different way of doing it. I was there to burn that out of them. It still feels like just yesterday, August 15, 1986. The day Operation Minesweep began, though it wouldn't be called that yet. A lot of work had gone into getting our material spliced into the audio systems, and it didn't go flawlessly. There were many setbacks over the several days of the festival and I had to tweak and revise many of my ideas and theories based on the behavioral changes I observed across the event's duration. It was a start though, and I was pretty happy with where things stood after day one. I had a lot of observations to read about, made by many of my colleagues who were also embedded in the crowd. So I was a bit annoyed when I was approached outside my tent by a young woman. She had introduced herself randomly, out of the nowhere. Not something I was really used to. Diane apparently. Not really knowing what else to do, and eager to get back to work, I reciprocated, hoping she'd go away afterwards. She wouldn't leave though. Apparently she had come alone and didn't really know anyone else at the concert. I guess she was a bit of a wallflower, or at least that was how she described herself. I'm not sure why she targeted me specifically. But I humored her. I wasn't a mean person, then or now. Maybe just confused. The work waited, and for perhaps the first time in my life, I just spent some time chatting with another person about things that weren't academic, despite my constant desire and attempts to steer the conversation in that direction. She did humor me as well though, eventually letting me talk a bit about what I did. I had to be careful though, a lot of it was highly classified. But I was good at moving between the lines, and it felt nice to unload some of my thoughts and ideas to someone new. Things sort of spiraled from there, and she ended up staying with me that night. She had apparently been looking to sleep with me, but I didn't have the courage, so we simply shared my tent. But the operation continued unabated. The next day it was right back into the grind. The Who and Jefferson Airplane were the background music as I collected my data. I had never really listened to much music, so most of it was new to me. The results weren't as good as I'd have liked, but they were noticeable. We performed what I called exit interviews with many of the people leaving the concert early. Our goal was to see why they thought they no longer wanted to be there. I am quite sure we were having an effect, but it wasn't easy to know exactly what these people were feeling or thinking from the stimuli we were barraging them with. They would just say things like "it's too rainy," or "I'm tired," or "I'm just not feeling it." Vague answers, some of which were probably truthful. But I could tell we were having an effect of some sort. We closely tracked the number of attendees, and it was undeniable that the crowds were starting to thin a bit even as the acts ramped up. We had to make adjustments to the frequencies pretty often. The tonal patterns we used were very experimental at the time. Not nearly as refined as they would later be. But it was a start at least. That first night, I had switched everything to an entirely new pattern I had come up with, one we had scarcely tested yet. Diane found me again a bit later. I guess at that point, I had been thinking about her somewhat already. I really hadn't ever thought much about women or romance before then, but after spending a night with her, I suppose I finally started to better understand what I might have been missing all these years. I was glad for her company. She wasn't like me at all though. I recall quite well some of her words at the time, words which I just didn't understand back then. Life is about love. It's about having fun. Expressing yourself. I definitely didn't understand it. But she said other things too. I want to help make the world a better place. A happier place. I want people to be nice, to be kind to each other. I did understand that. That was the mission, after all. To make the world a better place. I talked less about myself that night and actually listened to her own stories of her life. She had also had a father who fought in the World War. Her family had struggled in many ways like mine. But somehow, she had come out of it as a very different sort of individual than myself. That night was actually the first time I had ever had sex. She seemed kind of shocked when she found out, but helped me through the process. Funny that I call it a process. I guess old ways of thinking die hard, even after so many years. It was awkward for me at the time, but I still think about that night a lot. The next day was an important one. Day 2, we'd be testing my latest theory. This was one the Pentagon had a great interest in. They thought it could help with the war effort, and I thought maybe they were right. You couldn't actually hear the frequencies which flooded from the speakers as the musicians played. They were technically inaudible. But they would still affect you. The way you thought, the way you behaved. That day, the crowd grew increasingly intense and maybe even violent at times. I observed an increase in the number of people dancing. The amount of motion. The noises the crowd made. I was certain it was working, even if just a little. Compared to the apathy we had produced the day before, this surge of energy was obvious. If we could somehow use this to increase the aggressiveness and drive of our soldiers, maybe we could salvage that pitiful war in East Asia? That was the idea, anyways. I actually ended up having them cut off the signal once we started to observe some fights breaking out in the audience. I wasn't interested in creating more violence, I had the data I needed at that point. That night, she came again. And so did I. We spent more time talking afterward. She spoke to me about how she loved the energy and vibe of being in that place, that concert. I mostly just found it to be wet, dirty, noisy, and uncomfortable. By that point though, I had come to realize having someone to talk to about things beyond my work was a nice break from it. But when I started referring to many of the attendees as communists and hippies, I could see the annoyance in Diane grow. She clearly didn't see the world in the same way I did. Her words, as best as I remember them, were something like just wanting peace, wanting to have fun, being kind to each other. Is that communism to you? I guess I didn't really know back then. Communism was some amorphous threat. She didn't look like a communist. She just looked like a girl attending a show. It was hard for me to see at the moment, but I was relishing in her attention, even if I didn't really comprehend her perspective. Where I saw socialists and deviants, people who had wasted their potential and didn't love their country, she saw people just trying to have a good time. Were there political overtones? Sure, there were plenty of messages in the lyrics of the songs performed by the myriad musicians who graced, or maybe by my perspective back then, cursed the stage. But really, was I any different? I was sending out my own messages through those same speakers. The third day was our most important test. In a sense, it was the climax of the entire affair. We'd been doing polling with those in the audience to try and ascertain their political views. We did so under the guise of being reporters, chronicling the supposedly historic event. The idea was to see if we could change people's minds using the techniques I had developed. It seemed to work well in a laboratory setting, and we had many successes. We could actually almost fine-tune a person's perspective with the right stimuli. The brain is just a machine, after all. But could we do it at scale? That was the question that would be answered that day. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young were dominating the platform which loomed over the excited amalgamation of Americans, young and old, who had found their way to New York for this unwitting experiment. And through the speakers, the crowd was flooded with my greatest creation. My greatest hope for mankind. I was going to make people better. Our exit interviews were everything I could have hoped for. I don't think the subtlety of the effects could have been easily measured, but I was sure of it. Maybe it was just a leap of faith, but I made sure to talk to the same people I had talked to before, where possible. The difference was stark to me, even if it wasn't obvious to many of my peers. They matched what I expected based on our lab trials. Those who were leaving to head home were often describing feeling disaffected and generally apathetic about the concert and its purpose and ideals. It was only around 7 to 9% who displayed such a response, but for such a short exposure, that was significant. I was elated. Oddly enough, it was me who tracked down Diane that evening. I don't know why I was surprised when I found her consorting with another man. Free love, as they called it, had been happening all around me this entire time. I should have expected as much. But it did hurt. She didn't seem to think much of it. It wasn't like we were married, or had even been dating. In fact, I barely knew her. But I guess those 2 nights had ignited something in me which I wouldn't really come to fully understand until much later. But I didn't know how to deal with it at the time, so I retreated back to my work. There was still much to be done. Day 4 was phase 4. It was pretty much over for the attendees of our experimental concert, but for us the real work was only just beginning. It was time to see how well we had done. And that would take time. Over the next year or so, we continued to reach out to our subjects, pulling in as much information about them and their lives as we could under the guise of various phone polls and interviews. We also did similar for their friends and family, pretty much anyone in their orbit. I even did an exit interview and follow-ups with Diane. In fact, that was how we reconnected. My feelings for her were something I had at first underestimated. I had been quite sure she was just a fling, a brief flirtation in a moment of my life. So I was quite surprised when she shamelessly asked me if I wanted to go grab a few drinks at the end of one of my brief calls with her. I didn't drink, so I invited her over for dinner instead. Things progressed from there. I got to know her a bit better and we started dating more properly. It was odd, but somewhat exhilarating. At first, I think I was mainly just enamored with her because she was the first person I had ever been intimate with. But as I got to know her better, she started to reveal a whole new world. Where I saw weakness and threat, she saw humanity and hope. Where I saw social and political overtones, she saw self-expression. I remember joking with my dad that I was dating a commie during a Thanksgiving dinner, in her presence. She took it all in stride. I knew she wasn't a communist. She wasn't even political. She was just a person who wanted people to be able to be safe and happy in a world filled with more love. She drank and smoked and had sometimes done marijuana and fornicated. All the things I had almost entirely abstained from my entire life. On account of my condition, or so I had always told myself. Yes, it was true that my heart bled, and that tiny hole in it made me weak. But her heart bled in a different way, and she made me weak as well. Over the course of our first few months together, she helped me better understand that there is more to life than just work. Still, the work had to go on, and it was still my true love. I didn't have much time for her. She lived about an hour away, so seeing each other frequently was difficult. Our short relationship began to fade slowly, A sharp contrast to how quickly it had developed, like the sudden burst of flame of a lit candle flickering out in its own pool of wax. I thought it was just as well at the time, because we were about to finally pull the trigger. We'd gotten authorization from on high, and Operation Minesweep was about to go mainstream. I couldn't wait to see what the results of all my efforts would be. Could it actually work at that scale? Could it help end the war? Make people love each other and their country? Could I save people from all their bad tics and behaviors, all their bad opinions, and make them more like myself? So in the spring of 1971, we began the oral programming on a mass scale. It was just a few radio stations at first, but because they were localized, we could measure the results with surprising accuracy. Results were good, so we took it a step further. Schools with central audio were a perfect testing ground, the PA systems being able to transmit the inaudible frequencies throughout the entirety of a day. To whole schools, allowing us to compare a number of before and after metrics relating to the behavior and performance of the students. It wasn't long before they wanted to start testing the use of oral pattern programming on our men in uniform. The war wasn't going well, despite what the government tried to claim at the time. It had turned into a slow trudge through a foreign jungle hellscape, fought by veritable children who had barely finished high school. They needed morale support if they were going to mentally deal with the horrible conditions of the fight they found themselves in. So I expanded my testing in that direction. They wanted them to be more aggressive, desensitized, fearless. All tall orders, and even then I was unsure how I felt about this particular deviation from the original plan. I had gone into it to make people better, as people, not as soldiers. I still thought the war was important though, the domino collapse of what I thought of as democracy seeming as real to me as the ever-present risk of strategic nuclear war. This stage of the project went on for about a year. One of the things we noticed as we progressed was that the attempt to amp up aggression didn't really correlate well to better battlefield performance. Instead, things like hazings and fighting between men within their own units went up. This had the opposite effect on morale of that desired, so that project was eventually abandoned. Just as the war itself was. Sometimes I wonder if that phase of my work contributed to our eventual loss. I guess I'll never really know for sure, there are many factors at play in such things. But Operation Minesweep continued to roll out to the civilian population. By 1972, almost every radio and television station in the country had my oral programming patterns bleeding from them, into the minds and lives of a clueless American public. It wouldn't be until years later I'd really come to understand exactly what we had done. My first clue was when I met Diana again, after a few years of pretty much no contact. She had reached out to me out of the blue, apparently just wanting someone to talk to after her mother had passed away. I'm not sure why she chose me. But we met up, and we talked. It was pleasant enough. Or at least as pleasant as a conversation can be under those circumstances. She was clearly distressed, but she tried not to show it too much. I think she eventually started to feel better and I actually invited her to stay the night if she wanted to. She accepted. I had a guest bedroom she could use. We spent much of the evening talking and catching up before retiring. I remember feeling like she had changed somehow. She didn't talk in the way she used to. Or at least not with the same passion. She seemed more subdued, perhaps almost less caring. More interested in her own problems, little to say about those of others. She didn't ask much about me or my own life. Of course, she was grieving, and had grown older. I couldn't know at the time what causes might be at play, just as I couldn't know what causes led to our loss in Vietnam. Life is complicated, and we are the products of an uncountable number of external stimuli. We live in a complex environment, after all. But as the months passed after that, we started seeing similar patterns in the public at large. People were becoming more individualistic, more apathetic, more subdued, and less caring. It was subtle, but still statistically significant. I should have been elated, as I once had been. This was exactly what I had wanted all along, right? To make people better. Better citizens. But it is no coincidence that I say it made them less caring, and I'm not sure I would have really seen it had it not been for Diana. Because something about her had changed, and it took some time to put my finger directly on what it was. She had lost her bleeding heart. She was no longer as enthusiastic about making the world a better place. She mostly just thought and talked about herself and her own. Some of that I'm sure is just getting older. But the data for the population at large spoke for itself. Those higher up loved it. It was everything they could have hoped for. But seeing the passion stripped from Diana like that made me really begin to introspect on what exactly we were doing to people. Was I really making the world better? I started to wonder what effect it was having on me. After all, I had been exposed just as much as anyone else, if not more so. Was I still the same person I had been? I don't think I'll ever know for sure. It's no longer in my hands. I have been retired for a long time. But my pet project has been studied by countless other scientists, corporations, and governments. Because in the end, the mind is just a machine. It is programmed by its environment. Just like propaganda, any stimuli can affect how it works, how it thinks, how it dreams. Oral programming was just the beginning. They have much more sophisticated methods as well now. And it is everywhere. You have probably heard of such things, albeit from crackpots and conspiracy theories. This is a conspiracy in a sense, but it isn't a theory. And I am not a crackpot. Even as you read this, you are being exposed. I don't really know what the effects are. I don't have access to the most current methods, patterns, or results. But your mind isn't as much of your own as you think it is. I do wonder though, if the competing, crossing signals of so many different parties all trying to barrage you with their own ideas isn't somehow related to the deteriorating state of society in general. I mean, how can anyone deal with so much conflicting input? Is it even possible? Or is it driving us to collective neurosis? To madness? The future frightens me. I'm lucky in a sense, as my time has nearly come and gone. My heart condition has gotten better as I've gotten older though. Medicine has gotten better, and a surgery and some regimen of drugs has mostly helped the hole in my heart close. But my heart bleeds in a different way now. I try not to listen to radio or TV, or consume much media in general. It is all highly rationed. I wear earplugs when I go out in public. I think it has helped. I feel more hopeful. More compassionate. Maybe even more loving. I still want to make the world a better place. But that task will likely fall on you now. One thing I hear a lot is that my generation ruined the world. That we only took and left nothing but problems in our wake, passed down to our children. That might be true. I'm sure it is in some ways. But that wasn't the generation I remember seeing at Woodstock all those decades ago. That spirit they had, the desire to help and improve the world. To love it and each other. To spread happiness. It didn't just fade. It was killed. So the next time you hear an "okay boomer," or the next time you feel the need to complain about how my generation screwed everyone over. The next time you hear someone putting the blame on them. Don't blame them. Blame me. And buy earplugs. r/nosleep. Hosted by you/BrittonRT. I've created a hole to nowhere. I had some trouble deciding whether to write this, and once I had, I was unsure where to begin. Normally I would never speak about these things publicly, that's a serious taboo and under normal circumstances would land me in a world of trouble. But these aren't normal circumstances. You wouldn't know it, but your fates are shaped in ways you can't so easily recognize. But I can. And those like me. We see what is coming as clearly as you might see a storm brewing on the horizon, threatening to shower you in its torrent of rain and thunder. As clearly a glow of orange and blue heralds the rising of the sun. The days of deep and dark secrets are drawing to a close. Maybe not for a few hundred more years, but that time passes in the blink of an eye for me. When the Yor returns, you will be long dead, but I will remain. Along with those like me. So that's where I will begin. Myself, and those like me. My name is Arnold. We've been around a very long time. Much longer than any of the civilizations recorded in your tiny chronicles of history. Those texts you teach in schools and universities, those ancient records you collect and debate over represent such a small sliver of the greater past. If only you knew how many times the projects of man have risen and fallen over the eons. I come from a time before the time you know, as do my brothers and sisters. You may have encountered some of us, as we mingle and live among you. We mostly keep to ourselves, so you would never know. Excepting a few rare cases, you won't find us interfering in your affairs, politics, or otherwise attempting to steer your culture. In fact, it is forbidden, hence why this short admittance you are now reading will be so controversial once my peers become aware of it. What you are reading now breaks over 40,000 years of tradition which had only been violated on a handful of occasions, and almost always to disastrous results. We've had many labels over the millennia, usually gross misrepresentations of our true selves passed along over time like a game of telephone. Because there was a time, long ago, when you and I were the same. And the stories of that bygone era still linger in your cultural heritage, as fragments told and retold in 1,000 different ways. For the purposes of this text, I will give you the name we call ourselves. It is an arrogant and narcissistic name, fitting for us. It isn't even true, its meaning self-congratulating despite its inaccuracy. But it is how we always thought of ourselves. We were the first. But this isn't about us. We're just observers, scholars, tinkerers, scientists, and explorers. Withdrawn from the world at large to continue our own selfish quests for ever more cryptic knowledge, arcane and beautiful truths which we seldom share. This is about one who was far older and stranger than us. The Yore. We were only vaguely aware of it for most of our lengthy history. At the height of our power, we had seemingly conquered knowledge of the material. In our brilliance, we had dissected the universe as we saw it into neat formulae which could be used to predict and understand the world around us. Our ships carried us across sea, sky, and void alike, and many orbs were found. Some even still bear some of my brothers and sisters to this day, far across the dark expanse in which this world floats. And it was out in that endless emptiness we first became aware of the Yore. It was the first living thing we had ever discovered of non-earthly origin. How long it had been floating out there in the abyss, I could not say. But it was great and mysterious. Debates and arguments raged across 100 worlds as we tried to come to some collective consensus as to what should be done with the slumbering behemoth. I was one of the ones in favor of waking it. The excitement of finding such an unimaginable being drifting alone in the ether was too much for caution. But such a decision wouldn't be taken lightly, assuming it were possible at all, and it took several hundred of your years before a compromise was reached. The being would be studied closely and carefully, and I was one of many volunteers chosen for the task. We flew to it on the light ethereal, baking the heavens in the fires of our vessels as we began our 1,000-year voyage to meet this new stranger up close for the first time. That might seem a long time to you, but the journey was over nearly as quickly as it had begun. I still recall so clearly the excitement as we closed the gap during the final leg of the voyage. We couldn't see it in the darkness between the stars, not with our eyes, not in this place without light. But we knew it was there. The perimeter was a spherical positioning of our ships around the Yore, a figurative encapsulation which allowed us to monitor it from every angle. We carefully studied it from that distance for some number of years, painting a picture of the ancient creature through our works. It was surprisingly simple. Just a black sphere, an orb of utter darkness, like the holes scattered around the void which fed on the light of the stars. But the Yore was alive. We knew it was. It had spoken to us, long ago. The truth of its discovery was that we hadn't discovered it, that is. No, we merely picked up the phone. And now, so close to it, it spoke again. To all of us. We could hear it whispering to us in our dreams and waking moments. It knew things, many things, and it flooded us with its ideas and thoughts faster than we could put them to record. Still, we did our best, despite many of its concepts being hard to understand or make sense of. Unlike the light eaters, the black holes as you know them, the Yore did not grasp and pull at light and material. In fact, it pushed it away, repelling any attempts to draw close or to probe it. After some time had passed, it was finally agreed that we would pick one of our ships and attempt to make a superluminal approach. For all we knew, it would be suicide, the sacrifice of a few for the greater knowledge and learning of the many. My ship was picked. I remember feeling like it was watching us as space bent and warped around us, allowing us to pass through its reverse gravity and creep ever closer to the black orb. The closer we drew, the slower we grew, and the stronger the thoughts it sent us became. Standing in the navigator's hall, we watched as the black sphere turned into a black horizon, its distant curve growing ever straighter all around us as we approached. It seemed so much larger from up close. And then we passed through that horizon. It was uneventful, there was no obvious difference, just a true and complete black which now fully encompassed everything outside of our suddenly minuscule seeming vessel. But our scopes did detect something inside, something we couldn't see with our eyes. It was a hole. Or something like one. More so than the black thing we were already in, this was different entirely. It wasn't black, it was the absence of the very concept of color. It was like a piece of the fabric of reality was missing, replaced by non-existence. Not a void, but the lack of even that. The hole wasn't what was talking to us though. No, the Yore lived there, embracing the hole, obscured by it, camouflaged on its surface. We were still being repelled, so we burned the light and rode against the tide ever closer still, and my brothers, sisters, and I began to grow uneasy. The thoughts it shared with us were becoming angry, intense, bitter, even spiteful. The scopes piece by piece revealed the beast, though it was unlike anything we had ever encountered. When we eventually were close enough to be able to see it with the naked eye, we were within a ship's length of it. It felt close enough to touch. It was dark and web-like, but against the beacons of light we shone at it, it was clear against the nothingness of the hole it seemingly embraced. That light which bent away from the hole, never touching its surface but instead curving back outside the strange horizon through which we had passed. The other ships could see our light pouring back out of the entity. We were clearly visible to them despite being inside, but we could see nothing of the outside from within. Consensus dictated that we should return to the other vessels, and so we eased the fires and let our craft drift gently back out of the bizarre object, propelled by the outward force of its reverse gravity. Some time was spent studying the data we had recovered, and we began to speculate on the nature of the being. And the whole. The backward gravity bore some similarity to the rings of negative mass which served as our heavenly sails, and it was unclear how the yaw managed to remain so close to it instead of being repelled, almost as though it were sitting upon the whole skin, wrapped about it. More ships went in and returned. My very daughter and I, knowledge blessed, was on the vessel which first managed to get close enough to retrieve a physical sample of the yaw. This proved to be a pivotal moment, as it gave us a chance to discover something of its nature. And as some had already theorized, the yaw existed on the other side of gravity and mass. So even as the whole pushed us away, it sucked the yaw in. The anger it sent our way began to make more sense the more we learned. We were able to calculate how much energy would be required for the creature to escape the gravity well, and it became clear the yaw was probably trapped, imprisoned in the backward black hole. And once again, we found ourselves split into two camps, struggling to find consensus on what to do next. Many wanted to take what we had learned, along with our samples, and return home. There was so much we could discover still, even from the little we had gathered. But my daughter and I were part of the other camp, who argued that we should attempt to rescue the poor creature from the trap into which it had fallen. There were some ideas as to how it might be accomplished, and many, myself included, could only imagine the things we could learn still from such an timeless and exotic animal. Especially if we earned its goodwill. As was the custom in our culture, we compromised, with half the fleet returning to the orbs of the homeworlds while I remained with the others who would carry on the project. And carry on we did, for several hundred more of your years. A way to send information to the yaw was eventually found, one that it would respond to, and a dialogue began. Simple at first, but it grew in complexity over time. It was forthcoming with information, but we still struggled to grasp it even at the best of times. But a few things were clear. It was angry, trapped, and had been for many millions of years. It was starving, dying, and had been for many millions of years. And most notably, it wanted our help. It was a vindication, and we redoubled our efforts to find a way to somehow release it from its binds. And it took some time. A lot of time. But we would not be denied. We finally found our solution. To try and describe exactly how it worked would be wasted on you, but a lay version would be something like this. The material which allows us to bend the void around our vessels was attracted to the hole, just like the yaw. It was the reason we were able to penetrate the reverse event horizon at all. But those rings could be detached, and then the ships would be repelled out with dramatic force. We sacrificed several hundred of our ships in this way, their skeleton crews mostly perishing during the project. But their sacrifices were not in vain, and the ships carried the mass of the yaw out and away from its prison, past the event horizon, and into the void once again. And as soon as it was free, it took off without a word, off into the starlight, wrapped in the gentle bubble of a curved space-time. Toward the homeworlds. We pursued it, and it wasn't difficult. It was a slow thing, compared to us, and we left the light in our wake. But it no longer spoke to us or shared its thoughts. It no longer responded to our queries or prods. It just moved like it was slipping through the ether on wings, a black lattice which repelled the light and anything which came too close. Trailing it for over 3,000 years, it finally arrived at the orb from which we had launched the expedition, the outermost of the homeworlds, and my home. There are no words to describe the horror that consumed all of those who watched aboard the vessels of the fleet as the yaw collided with the orb at superluminal velocity. The force of the impact was so great that the creature buried itself deep into the orb's core, its backward gravity forcing the planet apart like an egg cracking open. I still think about the words my daughter spoke as we watched our home disappear in an instant. Fe Aken Ezeldeni 10F. We have freed a monster. To this day, I wonder if perhaps the yaw had been put there intentionally. Maybe by something or someone even older and vaster than it. I couldn't and still can't understand why it had turned on us after we had sacrificed time and immortal lives to free it. We had been far too careless though. Too trusting. We had told it who we were, where we lived, and almost everything we knew. We had been trying to make a friend, and our good intentions had been turned against us. Chasing it to orb after orb, world after world, we tried to engage and destroy the horror, but we were powerless to harm it. Its repellent nature made it impossible to attack with anything except superluminal projectiles, and even those barely contained enough energy by the time they reached it to do much more than give it a gentle poke. Meanwhile, a countless number of the homeworlds were annihilated by the rampaging eldritch predator. So we eventually scattered to the remaining ones like the four winds, using the advantage of our speed to arrive thousands of years before it would. To try and warn, or failing that, prepare. But the betrayal of the Yor has lived with us ever since, and we no longer freely share what we once gave gladly. I've been here for so long, working on my plan. My daughter's plan, truth be told. And the time grows close. The Yor is about 237 of your years away from this world. The days for me tick by like minutes, and the minutes feel short. But we did it. Today, we finally did it. We created a hole impossible to enter, a hole which leads to nowhere. One that repels instead of attracts. One which is darker than black itself. Just a small one. The final one will be much bigger. Much, much bigger. And that is why I have decided to write this to you all, against my better judgment. It brings me no joy that I must use your home in this manner. The bait for my trap. It won't be the Yor which destroys this orb. It will be me. Me and the others of the first who still linger here. Just know that when the hole tears this world apart and traps the Yor once more in its dark embrace, your loss will spare hundreds of other orbs, hundreds of other worlds. Their people spared, their planets intact, they will remember Earth and the many other places which the furious Yor deemed its prey for reasons beyond comprehension. I will die with your kind and kin. With your great-great-great-grandchildren, who will be there with an eye on me on that day when it finally arrives. I only hope that those who someday find this hole possess more sense and caution than we did. I only hope that my people remember that there are some things which lurk in the void which should be left alone. That not every living intelligence is a friend. That some things are a danger. That this thing is a danger. Though it is meant to be a secret, as I stared into the utter bleakness of the hole we had made for the first time, I knew I had to say something. To tell you all the truth, even if it was forbidden. To apologize. And I can only hope that you can forgive me. I believe your sacrifice will not be forgotten.